She didn't hear the cars pull up. She had been in the kitchen the way she was every Sunday morning. Coffee going, something on the stove, the radio on low. When the knock came, Loretta Mae Washington opened her front door and found 5 men standing on her porch. They were large and wide-shouldered and dressed in their good clothes, and the one in front was holding flowers. And when Loretta saw their faces, those faces she had memorized 20 years ago when they were small and frightened and nobody had wanted them, she made a sound she had never made before in her life. Not a word, something older than words. Her hand went to her mouth, her knees bent slightly, and the man in front stepped forward and caught her the way she had caught him 100 times in 20 years, and held her the way she had taught him that safe people hold each other. They were all crying by then, all 6 of them, on the porch of the house on Meridian Street, where they had all, in one way or another, become who they were. What they had come to tell her, what they had driven from 4 different states to stand on this porch and say, she wouldn't fully hear for another hour, when the tears had slowed enough for words. But she already knew the shape of it. She had always known. That was the thing about Loretta Washington. She had seen the men in these boys 20 years before anyone else had been willing to look. 22 years earlier, this is where it starts. Loretta Washington was 43 years old and had been a licensed foster parent for 11 years when the call came about the first boy. Before foster care, she had raised 2 biological children, Marcus and Denise, both adults by then, both gone into their own lives, and had found in the quiet of the house on Meridian Street, not emptiness, but space, room for more. She was a practical woman, not given to grand declarations of purpose. She did not describe fostering as a calling. She described it the way she described everything, as a thing that needed doing and that she happened to be able to do. She was a retired school cafeteria manager. She had a pension, a paid-off house, a 2004 Buick LeSabre, and a vegetable garden in the backyard that she treated with the same systematic attention she gave to everything. She cooked real food every night. She kept a clean house. She was in bed by 10 and up by 5:30. She had rules, not many, but clear ones, consistently enforced, and she had warmth. The kind that is not performative and not conditional, the kind that exists independently of whether it is appreciated, which in her line of work it frequently was not. The social worker who called her about the first boy was a woman named Carol Sims, whom Loretta had worked with for 6 years and trusted. Carol said, "Loretta, I have a boy who has been in 4 placements in 3 years, and I need you to hear me when I tell you he is not a bad child. He is a child who has been failed so many times he has stopped expecting anything else." The boy's name was Deshaun. He was 9 years old. He had been removed from his mother's care at 6, placed in a group home at 7, moved to a foster home that disrupted at 8, placed in a second home that also disrupted. He had a school record that described him as defiant and disruptive, which Carol Sims, who had read the file 3 times, understood as the behavioral language of a child who has learned that adults cannot be trusted and who is therefore testing every adult he encounters to confirm what he already knows. Loretta said, "When can he come?" Deshaun arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a car with Carol Sims and a trash bag containing everything he owned. He walked into Loretta's house without speaking, stood in the middle of the living room looking at things, and said after a long silence, "You got a lot of stuff." Loretta said, "Some of it used to belong to other kids. They coming back for it? Some of them visit," she said. "Some moved on. You can use what you want." He used the blue blanket from the top of the closet shelf. He slept with it every night for 4 years. The second boy came 6 months later. His name was Caleb. He was 7, mixed race, the child of a mother who had lost her parental rights and a father who had never acknowledged him. He was quiet in a way that worried Loretta more than noise. The quiet of a child who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Who flinches at raised voices not because he's been struck, but because raised voices have always preceded something he couldn't control. He was academically behind and terrified of being behind, and he cried at night in a way he clearly believed no one could hear. Loretta heard. She always heard. She did not go in immediately, because she understood that some grief needs to be private before it can be shared. But she left a glass of warm milk on the table outside his door every night for 2 weeks without comment. On the 15th night, she was sitting at the kitchen table when he came out, and she had a glass for herself, and she didn't say anything for a while. And then she said, I used to cry at night too when I was young. Caleb looked at her. What did you do? I got up, she said, and I found something warm. He sat at the table with her. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The third boy was Marcus too, named after a grandfather. Nobody in the house called him anything but two. Who arrived at 10 already containing a rage that Loretta recognized immediately as grief that had been refused every legitimate expression. He had been in the system for 4 years. He had a list of behavioral incidents that ran to 2 pages. He had never once, in 4 years of caseworker notes, been described by any adult as possessing anything to build on. Loretta read the file and said to Carol Sims, "What does he love?" Carol blinked. What? Everybody loves something. What does he love? Nobody had asked. Carol went back through the file, found one notation. From a group home director 2 years prior, Marcus demonstrates unusual engagement during woodshop activities. Loretta bought a beginner woodworking set from the hardware store the week before he arrived. She left it on the kitchen table, unwrapped, with a note that said, "I heard you're good with your hands." Two stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at it. Then he picked up a piece of wood and a chisel, and he started working, and he worked for 2 hours without speaking. And by the end of the 2 hours, he had not made anything recognizable, but he had been, for the first time in a long time, a boy doing something instead of a boy being managed. He never had another behavioral incident in Loretta's house. The fourth boy, Jerome, came at 13, the age when the system's hope for a child often expires, when the invisible calculus of adult effort tips toward placing a child somewhere containable rather than somewhere transformative. Jerome had aged through the most adoptable years without being adopted, had watched younger children placed ahead of him in homes that would become families, and had developed as a consequence the particular armor of a child who has decided not to want what he has learned he cannot have. He was not defiant. He was distant, unreachable in the specific way of a person who has simply stopped arriving. He sat at Loretta's dinner table the first night and ate without speaking, and went to his room. She let him. She did not require conversation. She did not perform welcome. She put food on the table every night and kept his room clean, and drove him to school every morning at 7:15. And after 3 weeks of this, Jerome came downstairs one Saturday morning and said, "You need help with that garden?" "Always," Loretta said. He worked in the garden with her every Saturday for 2 years. They talked, eventually the way people talk when they are doing something with their hands, sideways, in pieces, without the pressure of eye contact. He told her things he had not told anyone. She listened without interrupting, without flinching, without the particular expression that adults sometimes wore when they heard hard things from children. The expression that communicated, "This is too much for me." Nothing Jerome said was too much for Loretta. She had a capacity for absorbing pain that she herself did not fully understand. She only knew that she had it, and that it seemed to be what the children who came to her most needed. The fifth boy, Michael, arrived the week before Jerome's 16th birthday. He was 8 years old, the youngest of the 5. He had spent his first 3 years of life in a situation the caseworker file described in the careful institutional language that is the bureaucratic equivalent of looking away. And he had come out of it with the particular damage of a child whose earliest architecture of trust had been built on a foundation that didn't hold. He startled at sudden movements. He hoarded food, bread under his pillow, crackers in his sock drawer, even after months in Loretta's house, because some part of him had not learned yet that the food would still be there tomorrow. He did not ask for things. He waited, watching the room the way small animals watch clearings. Alert, still, measuring the distance to safety. Loretta did not try to fix this. She understood, in the practical way she understood most things, that you cannot talk a child out of what their nervous system learned before language. What you could do was be consistent, reliable, the same, day after day, until eventually the nervous system received enough data to update its predictions. She put a snack on Michael's nightstand every night. Not a big thing. An apple, some crackers, a small juice box, without comment, without ceremony, just there when he woke in the night, convinced of the scarcity he'd been taught. She did this for a year before he stopped hoarding the crackers in his sock drawer. She said nothing when he stopped. She just kept putting the snack on the nightstand. He was 17 before he could really say what that had meant to him. He tried once, imperfectly, and Loretta said, "Baby, I know." That was usually enough. She raised all 5 of them, not temporarily, not as a way station. She raised them the way she had raised Marcus and Denise, inside a structure of expectations and warmth that did not offer options about kindness, about honesty, about showing up. She attended every school meeting, every sporting event, every performance and award ceremony and graduation that any of them had. She drove them to practices and tutoring and church and appointments. She stayed up waiting when they were late and sat with them when they were failing and stood in the back of every room where they received something good and never once made the moment about herself. She did not have money. She had enough, the foster care stipends, her pension, the careful management of a household where nothing was wasted. But she was not a woman of resources. She was a woman of presence. And in the accounting of what children need, presence turned out to be worth more than she had ever been told it was. Remember this, because what happened 20 years later is only comprehensible through the lens of what she chose to do in these years, in this house, on this ordinary street, for these 5 boys that the system had decided were beyond reasonable investment. Deshawn was the one who organized it. He always had been, the oldest, the one who arrived first, the one who understood earliest what Loretta was and what she had given them, and who had spent 15 years trying to find a way to name it adequately and had eventually decided that naming was not the point. The point was showing up. She had taught him that. He made the calls in October, 2 months before her birthday in December. Called Caleb first. Caleb was in Charlotte, running a construction company he had started at 28 that now employed 60 people, many of them young men who had been where Caleb had been. Called 2, who was in Detroit, teaching high school woodshop and coaching the wrestling team at the same school he had almost been expelled from twice before Loretta intervened at a parent-teacher meeting that he still talked about with the specificity of someone describing a turning point. Called Jerome, who was the closest an hour north of Atlanta, practicing family law, which everyone who knew his story understood was not a coincidence. Called Michael, who was in Seattle working as a child welfare caseworker, which was also not a coincidence, and who had been in therapy for 9 years and credited both Loretta and his therapist equally and without embarrassment for the fact that he was functional and loved and able to be in a room with other people, without flinching. 5 phone calls, 5 men, 4 states, 1 December morning, 1 porch on Meridian Street. Deshawn bought the flowers. Caleb drove. 2 made a plaque, mahogany, hand-carved inlaid letters. 40 hours of work. That said simply, the woman who showed up. Jerome had drafted the letter that they would read to her, the letter that said the things that had been true for 20 years and had never been collected into a single document before. Michael had brought a framed photograph, the 6 of them taken by Carol Sims at a birthday party in 2006, the one where Loretta had made a 3-layer chocolate cake and Deshawn had stuck his finger in the frosting and denied it with frosting on his face. And all 5 boys were laughing, and Loretta was laughing, and the kitchen was full of light, and that light was still in the photograph 18 years later. They drove to Meridian Street on a Saturday morning in December, the 5 of them in Caleb's truck, because it was the only vehicle that fit everyone. They were quiet on the drive in the way they were always quiet together. The specific comfortable silence of people who have enough shared history that silence is not absence but presence. Deshawn knocked on the door. Loretta sat on the porch for a long time after the tears slowed. Jerome brought her coffee from the kitchen. She took it a particular way. 2 sugars, just a little milk he had never forgotten. And 2 set up the folding chairs that had lived on the back porch since 2003, and Michael sat on the steps, the way he had sat on those steps as a boy, close enough to be touching the house. And Caleb told a story from 2007 that made everybody laugh and then cry again. The specific laugh cry of people who share a history long enough to have arrived at a place where the hard parts and the good parts have become so entangled they can no longer be separated, and you'd no longer want to try. Deshawn sat beside Loretta, and she kept her hand on his arm the way she had kept her hand on his arm when he was 9 years old, and didn't yet know what to do with kindness, just letting it be there, not requiring anything from it, teaching by contact what language couldn't reach. Jerome read the letter. He had written it the way he wrote everything, carefully, with the precise language of a man who had learned that words were instruments and that instruments handled well could reach places nothing else could. He read about what it had felt like to sit at a table where the food appeared every night, and nobody monitored whether you deserved it. He read about the garden and the Saturday mornings, and the way she listened without the expression that said, "This is too much." He read about the woodworking set with the note that said, "I heard you're good with your hands," and two made a sound and looked away at the yard, and Loretta put her hand on his arm. He read the last part slowly. He had written it carefully because he knew it was the most important part, and he wanted it to land the way it deserved to land. "You did not save us," he read. "You did something harder and more specific than saving. You saw us. You saw what we were capable of before we could see it ourselves, and you stayed in the room with that belief for 20 years without asking us to be grateful for it. We are grateful. We have always been grateful. But what we came here to say is simpler than gratitude. We came to say, we know what you did. We know what it cost. We know the Sunday mornings and the school meetings and the nights you sat up and the times you drove and the things you went without so we could have what we needed. We know, and we wanted you to know that we know. That is all. That is everything." Loretta didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at all five of them. Deshaun with the empty flower wrapper still in his hands. Caleb wiping his face with the back of his wrist. Two looking at the yard with his jaw working. Jerome folding the letter precisely. Michael on the steps with his face open in the way it had taken him years to learn to leave open. She said, "You all turned out." It wasn't a small thing to say. It was the largest thing she knew how to say. In the vocabulary of Loretta Washington, "you turned out" was not a compliment about achievement or status or arrival. It was something more specific. You became who you were always capable of being. You did not disappear. You are here. They understood this. They had been raised to understand this. Two brought the plaque out from the truck and hung it beside the front door, in the spot where the house numbers had always been, using the level he had brought in his bag because he was constitutionally unable to hang something crooked. He stood back and looked at it. The woman who showed up. Loretta looked at it for a long time. "That's a good piece of work," she said. Two turned around. His face was the face of the 10-year-old boy in the kitchen, with the woodworking set and the note. And it was also the face of the 44-year-old man who had taught 200 teenagers how to make things with their hands. And it was both of these at once. "I had a good teacher," he said. She put her hand on his face the way she had put her hand on his face the first time he cried in her kitchen 20 years ago, when the rage had cracked and underneath the rage was the child, as it always was. The December light came low and gold across the porch of the house on Meridian Street. The coffee was warm. The plaque caught the light, and Loretta Washington, 63 years old, retired cafeteria manager, licensed foster parent, woman of extraordinary presence and ordinary resources, sat on her porch surrounded by 5 men who had driven from 4 states to stand on her steps and be, for a morning, the children she had loved into becoming. She had not asked for any of it. She had not done it for any of it. She had done it because it needed doing, and because some people simply know, without being told, that showing up for the ones no one else will show up for is not a sacrifice. It is a privilege, the most serious kind there is.